The President of the United States is threatening some of his country's oldest allies. They've been some of America's most reliable trading partners. They've shared intelligence, they bought American films, foods and, crucially, American weapons. These countries answered the call to fight after the horrific attacks of September 11th. Their soldiers fought and died in Korea, Iraq and Afghanistan. It's not been purely transactional either. They held a shared belief in democracy, freedom and the fact that laws matter and that success can only be achieved in partnership. Under US leadership, they built the longest-lasting and biggest military alliance the world has ever seen. All of that can be at risk. Partnership, profit at risk. Why? Because the United States of President says he wants Greenland no matter what. I'm Alex Cadier right here on TVP World, and this is The Wider View. Well, it was a real marmalade dropper, the US president threatening tariffs on some of his country's staunchest and oldest allies. And joining me in the studio to help pick your jaws off the floor are Heather Grabbe and Jack Parrock. Heather with the Bruegel think tank, specialising in the intersection of geopolitics, of economic security, climate impacts and much more. Jack, a very experienced broadcaster and journalist who's been covering Brussels for years, and of course was reported extensively from Greenland itself. Welcome, both of you. Thank you for joining us. Jack, I'll start with you. So much of this discussion is high-level, theoretical. What will the US do? How is Trump feeling? What will the Europeans do? What do the people of Greenland want?
Good question, and I'm glad you started there, to be honest, because I think especially in Greenland, the people just do not feel that they've been heard. The context of this is that for many decades, Greenlandic politics has been dominated by their desire to actually become an independent country and remove themselves as an autonomous nation of the Kingdom of Denmark. That has been the overarching political position, and all of the main political parties are in favour of independence. The question is how quickly or how would they proceed with that? And last week, when all of this bubbled up, we saw Jens Frederik Nielsen, the Greenlandic Prime Minister, come out and say something so drastic that I think kind of fell away in the big noise of the Trump tariffs and all of this stuff that's going on. And he said, stood next to the Danish Prime Minister, we would rather be with Denmark than the United States. That is a very serious political shift for the Greenlandic people, and shows actually that what Trump has done has turned the sort of political discourse in Greenland against the United States now. I think that's fair to say.
So that statement from the the Greenlandic minister would have been extremely controversial in Greenland just a few months ago.
It would have been political suicide. Honestly, it would be really difficult. Everyone in Greenland wants to leave the Kingdom of Denmark. That's now shifted. I think he will return to his position in coming months, that actually they would like to be an independent country. He hasn't changed away from that. He said we prefer to be with Denmark, but it's definitely a big shift in what Greenlandic politics wants to show to the rest of the world and to Europe as well.
Let's bring Donald Trump into the conversation, as we must with this conversation. I want to play a clip of the letter he sent the Norwegian Prime Minister about this. Let's have a listen.
Dear Jonas, considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 wars plus, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace, although it will always be predominant, but can now think about what is good and proper for the United States of America. Denmark cannot protect that land from Russia or China, and why do they have a right of ownership anyway? There are no written documents, it's only that a boat landed there hundreds of years ago, but we had boats landing there also. I have done more for NATO than any other person since its founding, and now NATO should do something for the United States. The world is not secure unless we have complete and total control of Greenland. Thank you, President Donald J. Trump.
So that statement from the US President. Heather, I'm going to bring you in here. Of course, we can talk about the Nobel Peace Prize. We can talk about some of the more emotionally charged comments from the President there. Let's focus on the practical. What, in your view, does President Trump want from Greenland that he can't already have through partnership with Denmark in NATO, etc.?
Well, there's plenty more he could actually move into because it's clear that the NATO allies, including Denmark, are willing to negotiate with him. And I think what they tried to do by sending reconnaissance forces to Greenland last week was really to show him that they're willing to go in and defend Greenland, that it is defensible, that they're willing to contribute to that. But he has either chosen or has interpreted that as being a further militarization of the situation. But clearly there's more that could be done through negotiations and diplomacy. But he's pushing this, it seems, for several different reasons, some of which are not compatible with the diplomatic outcome. He's pushing it because he's interested in mining and the potential for example, rare earths and other critical raw materials to come out of Greenland. But again, that's something that you could also negotiate, and where American firms can go in there. Chinese firms, of course, are already there. So that's something that could be discussed. And in fact, that's an area where working with the EU would pay off for the US because you could have a joint EU-US push to try to keep Chinese interests out of mining in Greenland. But he hasn't chosen that route. So what other things does he want? Well, another thing is potentially fossil fuel reserves there. But again, more would be achieved through cooperation rather than confrontation. But what he also seems to want is some kind of big win for himself personally and for his presidency, some kind of territorial gain for the United States. He hasn't mentioned, or certainly not recently, the fact that a previous US president negotiated to buy Alaska from Russia long ago. Maybe he has that in mind as a precedent, but he hasn't gone into at all what would it mean for the US to have Greenland as a territory. Would it be an arrangement like Puerto Rico or like Guantanamo? All of these details are never discussed by him. So it seems to be much more about some kind of grand gesture, which is good for his ego, which is good for his image as a president. And it's very hard to know what the Europeans could offer that would satisfy that demand.
Well, we heard from the Danish foreign minister talking about this. He said, if you do take over Greenland, I'm not sure the United States will be particularly open to providing the kind of welfare and healthcare that Denmark does provide to Greenland. Let's bring it back to Greenland itself. You heard Heather talking about mineral resources, oil. Sometimes the US perspective presents Greenland as this El Dorado of minerals freely available, ready to be taken. All the development has been there. Jack, you've been there. There's still a lot of work to be done to be able to access these resources. It's not just a case of wandering in saying, oh, there's a lovely pot of rare earth, let me go back to the US. It's actually not underdeveloped, but it's not massively developed in that sense.
It's not, and the ores that are there are quite complicated and complex as far as I understand. I'm certainly no mineral expert, but one of the political realities is that currently in Greenland there's been a freeze on new licenses to mine, and that's a big political issue that is controlled by the Greenlandic government as well. Truth is, if the United States wanted to push hard against the Greenlandic government to get this moving, they could. They could do that. The reality of Greenland right now is that the biggest military base on Greenland is an American base. The few soldiers, the handful of soldiers that the Europeans sent, they're not defending this massive ice sheet that exists there. And I think this is one of the peculiarities of what Trump demands. I really want to see Donald Trump go to Greenland personally, because the way that the cities work, Nuuk as a capital, it's a closed circuit. You fly in, every car that's on the road stays within the circuit. You can't drive to Ilulissat or Sisimiut, one of the others. You fly there or you take a boat. All of Greenlandic life exists just within the first sort of 3-4 kilometres maximum of the Greenlandic coast. And it's all on the west coast, most of the settlements, whereas most of the allegations of where these Russian and Chinese ships, as Donald Trump says, are through the east coast. And whenever you're in Nuuk, the capital, there's a warship, a Danish warship, that's always sort of visible in the fjord. The Danes would happily let half of the American Navy into those areas should they want to as part of the NATO military alliance. So one questions, what more control does Trump want? He could put a few good lobbyists, a few military installations. Greenland's basically his. The Danes deal with the social side of things. But it's not about that, I don't think. I think we can clearly say now it's about an expansionist attitude. Donald Trump wants the United States to be bigger.
It goes back to Heather's point, which was he wants a win. He wants a big, shiny win, perhaps a mission accomplished banner, as US presidents have had such success in deploying, and a flag and some kind of press conference, and perhaps that was, I guess, your point. It's not just about the practical of it, it's also the show, which obviously we've become very used to with Donald Trump. A question for both of you. I'll start with you, Heather. We've seen a lot of big statements from Donald Trump, a lot of Truth Social posts on a Monday which actually kind of fizzle out by a Friday. This seems to have a bit more staying power, at least in terms of him really wanting this. Could this still be an empty threat that can be appeased with some conversations with European partners, or is this really now a big, big threat?
Well, he's kept coming back to this issue. He said a lot of things which he then dropped, but we're now nearly a year into this presidency, he's kept coming back to this issue of Greenland. It's something that he seems to care a lot about. Also, members of his family and others have shown an interest in it. And I think it's very interesting what Jack suggests, that maybe he should go there and actually see the reality for itself. That might make a difference. But there have been some shifts in this past year, also in perhaps understanding of the Trump administration about what's at stake. There seemed to be an assumption at the beginning that the Greenlandic people would welcome the US becoming US citizens rather than Danish citizens, for example. But that, as Jack was pointing out, has now been disproved by the reaction in Nuuk itself. There have also been assumptions that the Europeans might be really open to a deal rather quickly, and then it's turned out that this is a red line. So there's also been a learning process going on here. So he keeps returning to the issue, but with different angles to it. The new angle now is the threat of tariffs for not giving Greenland. So he's not going to it with military threats to the Europeans, but he is going with economic threats. And a 10% tariff would be a serious thing for the 8 European countries that he's talked about imposing them on, especially if they rose to 25%, as he's also said. Now, not clear he can do this. Already, we're imminently, the Supreme Court will be issuing a ruling on the legality of the tariffs he's imposed so far. He could face legal obstacles in the United States. But it's damaging to investment, it's damaging economically to the Europeans as well as to the Americans if this led to an all-out trade war, because this is a European red line. And what I think is really interesting at this point is Europe is having to sit up straight, and the Europeans are having to think about, OK, what are we really prepared to do? The strategy of appeasement, trying to play it long, trying to hope that he will chicken out of things in the end. This is not working on this issue. On this issue, he just keeps coming back to it, and it's escalating. So are the Europeans prepared to escalate a lot further? Are they prepared to take economic pain of actually having tariffs imposed for maybe a short time, but nevertheless imposed and disrupting trade, in order to defend this territory which most Europeans hadn't even heard about until quite recently? So this is a critical moment for, not so much for Trump as for Europe, to decide what the response is going to be and whether to change strategy away from placating Trump into a much more muscular approach.
Well, let's hear from the Europeans. Let's hear from Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, speaking in the last few hours. Let's have a listen.
Alliances endure because they're built on respect and partnership, not pressure. That is why I said the use of tariffs against allies is completely wrong. It is not the right way to resolve differences within an alliance. Nor is it helpful to frame efforts to strengthen Greenland's security as a justification for economic pressure. Any decision about the future status of Greenland belongs to the people of Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark alone. That right is fundamental, and we support it. A trade war is in no one's interest, and my job is always to act in the UK's national interest.
So, Jack, Keir Starmer there slightly drawing the red line that Heather was referring to earlier, but not necessarily really putting the boot in, still saying that he wants to talk to Donald Trump, have a discussion and figure out an off-ramp, effectively.
Definitely. I mean, when I hear that, I think, what special relationship, right? Are you going to put tariffs on your supposedly best friend, the US-UK relationship? The UK not really so involved in this situation, just sent, like, I think 1 or 2 people to Greenland in order to do it. I mean, this is it. We've seen as well, not only the British Prime Minister, but the Danish Prime Minister called this blackmail, blackmail, using economic tariffs in order to try and force their hand on this issue of Greenland. It is always going to be a red line, especially here in Brussels. The entire ethos and thinking of the European Union and its trade policy is to go out there, sign up free trade deals, use it as a soft power to try and make friends, bring money in, open up, change markets, increase standards all over the world. It's completely contrary to try and use trade in order to take over territories. That's against everything that this political sort of set of institution, the bubble as we call it here in Brussels, is about.
And on that, Heather, I mean, we're talking about countries that for 80 years at least have been fighting alongside US troops, trading very openly with the United States. Denmark in particular lost a higher proportion of its soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan than any other country. Let's zoom out a bit. How much of an earthquake is this in the way that these countries are aligned and allied and the way the Western world is run?
This is a deep split and a fundamental change, not only since the Second World War and the creation of NATO, but actually going back to the start of the United States, when the US became independent of Britain, but has been trading and working with different parts of Europe ever since then. So this is a very fundamental change. And there's a paradox here that what the European countries have been trying to do is to keep the US as an ally. But now they're finding that the US treats them as the enemy. It's really become a very deep problem. There was a belief this time last year in Brussels that the biggest problem with Trump was going to be that he might try and force the Europeans to join him in a trade war against China, that they would be forced into a different kind of alliance, an economic alliance, which was much more exclusionary, much more protectionist than they were comfortable with. There was a lot of anxiety about being forced to use, for example, the anti-coercion instrument of the EU against China. And now, a year on, we're thinking about using the anti-coercion instrument against the United States. This is not at all what it was designed for. So, but the problem is that because of this belief in the alliance and this very long history with the US in both security and economic terms, that the EU now, all of the European countries, have such a deep dependence on the United States, definitely in security terms, but also in economic terms, also in the digital sphere, that you can't just cut it off. A trade war would be incredibly damaging to both economies, but you'd really feel the pain in Europe. But a security rift of the kind that this is now threatening to provoke could mean, for example, the US withdrawal of new kinds of support from Ukraine, not only financial support, that's already happened, but also intelligence sharing and other essential things that the Europeans cannot replace. And that's the big, big threat. The economic side is one thing, but the security side is an even bigger challenge, because the Europeans are now trying to build up their defences, take over some of the strategic enablers, actually develop the capacity to do that from the US, but it will take time. And Trump is not allowing time. He's not saying, OK, I'm giving you until 2030 to get your act together, and I mean it this time. He's saying it's now.
Well, it'll take time. It'll take a lot of money, which, if they're having a trade war with the United States at the same time, will put pressure on European public finances, which aren't necessarily in the best of shape across the continent either. So there's a big risk, as you say, from both. I want to bring it back to that anti-coercion instrument, which in Brussels is a kind of widely used term. Headline writers have called it the trade bazooka, which for television purposes is probably a bit more fun. Well, exactly right. Well, you volunteered to give us an explanation, Jack. Can you walk us through exactly what that looks like, how it works?
So it was created essentially for Taiwan, the issue that China had basically used massive economic coercion against Lithuania for its support of Taiwan, and really, really restricted the Lithuanian economy to do so. And the EU said, right, we need to do something about this. They created this anti-coercion instrument, which still has never been used. And that's the real big question at the moment. moment. How is it going to be used? Is it powerful enough? It could do things. It will essentially give the European Commission, which is in charge of trade anyway, but the chance, the possibility to massively ramp up tariffs, to do things like restrict market access, potentially to the country that they're targeting, restrict access for foreign investments, public procurement in the European Union. There's lots of different things it can do. So even if it's invoked, the question is how strongly and bravely would the Commission do it? The other thing that I'll say about this, Trump doesn't really know what the anti-coercion instrument is or really care about these kind of things. The big question is, what does Trump care about? He doesn't care about tariffs response. He uses tariffs all over the place, slaps them on them, gets the retaliatory tariffs. The question is, what does he care about? And American businesses, if you see the loudest that they shout, it's about the EU's tech regulation. It's about the restrictions on access to data and the way that EU citizens use them. So perhaps there might be some discussions, we will see it when EU leaders come for their summit on Thursday here in Brussels, whether there's also a discussion about using other sideline instruments which could come under the trade bazooka that are most onerous to Donald Trump and to the businesses in America.
We don't have a huge amount of time left, but I do want to touch on Ukraine with you. There may be some knock-on effects. We heard Scott Bessent saying, European leaders are going to have to get on board with Greenland because if we pull away from, security partnerships and we move away from Ukraine, the whole thing collapses. Is he right?
Certainly there are aspects of US support to Ukraine that are essential, which the Europeans couldn't replicate. And that's a big worry. That's a really big worry for all of the NATO allies. And it's also difficult, frankly, to replace the US strategic enablers for the defence of Europe as well. So the relationship between Trump and Putin really matters as well. What might Putin ask for in this juncture? Putin hasn't spoken out very much recently, not only on Greenland, but also on Iran and Venezuela. He hasn't come to the assistance of regimes that he has himself supported in the past. So Putin is at the moment clearly considering his position. That's a very big worry for the European Union. I think it is leading to some fundamental shifts in how European countries approach defence. We're going to see, as you were mentioning earlier, a lot more spending on defence. But the problem is how to deal with this in the short term, how to keep Ukraine going. Now, Trump's been talked down from positions of basically abandoning Ukraine before. We've seen a number of crisis points when Zelensky and others have gone to Trump and tried to explain what's going on the front line. And we've managed to get through those. And the US is still providing security support. But it's very clear that over the next years, the Europeans are going to have to take on a lot more of that. And they're going to have to think beyond the situation now. So, for example, talk about some kind of partial membership of the EU for Ukraine. That's been provoked by these concerns. Also, ideas that have been discussed, such as new kinds of security guarantees. Now, Trump might also, at some point, be willing to give security guarantees. But we've got a rough ride ahead. There's another 3 years of this presidency. Things may change with the midterms coming this year, especially if economic pain from the tariffs causes difficulties for the Republicans in the midterms. That might calm Trump's ardor for trade wars. But we can't go on with a sort of muddling through approach to dealing with Trump. There needs to be some strategy on the European side.
I want to give you both a final word. I will promote you both separately as heading up the delegation of European countries at Davos this week, meeting with President Trump. And because of our time constraints, you only have one sentence for the US president to represent the European position and to make him shift his position. Jack, I'll give you the task of going first. What's your one sentence leading the European delegation to Donald Trump?
Such a difficult question. I honestly don't know, but I think that they need to make it super clear that Greenland will not be given. I would say that they need to make it so clear, that red line, but then the Europeans are going to have to decide what they're willing to do to back it up. This is about values versus prosperity. Are European citizens willing to sacrifice some prosperity for the value of retaining territorial integrity? It's what Ukraine is doing in its fight against Russia's invasion. Will the Europeans support one of their member states in Denmark on the same campaign?
Your one sentence.
we can impose real economic pain on you. Do you really want that ahead of the midterms and your own re-election campaign?
She was much better than me.
You were both brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us on The Wider View. It's been a real pleasure to have you.
Thanks so much, Alex.
And that's it for this edition of The Wider View. We can impose pain on the United States, but we Europeans need to figure out if we are willing to sacrifice some prosperity for those European values. Jack Parrock, thank you so much. Heather Grabbe, a real pleasure. And stay tuned right here on TVP World.